Welcome everybody to Tambor is a Many-Splendored thing. To start things off, we're going to have Professor Lloyd Whitesell, who's the Associate Dean of Research and Administration here, give us a little welcoming address.
Bienvenue à Montreal, and welcome to the Schulich School of Music. And we're really glad to have you all here for this conference. First, I want to acknowledge that McGill University is located on land that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We honor, respect, and recognize these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and water on which McGill now stands. So you can read some words of welcome from our Dean, Brenda Ravenscroft, in the program. So I just want to catch my breath. It must be that I want to sing something, and now all of a sudden I can't breathe. So I just want to say a few words of inspiration. So in case you aren't familiar with the song that inspired the title of this conference, here it is. Love is a many-splendored thing. It's the April rose that only grows in the early spring. Okay, there we go. Or on dirait les splendeurs diverses de l'amour, les splendeurs diverses du timbre. Love is a many-splendored thing. Tambor is a many-splendored thing. So I take my words of inspiration from the song title, word number 1, many. And this conference, I would say, is truly unusual and remarkable in the multiplicity and diversity of perspectives that you all bring to the table. Word number 2, splendor. By focusing on the magnificence of Tambor, by treasuring it, by making it the star of the show, this conference gets us to rethink hierarchies of value. Word number 3, love. This is the phantom word behind the title of the conference, but I know that behind all of your work lies an intense love for what you do. So in these next few days, be inspired by diversity, magnificence, and passion, and enjoy the conference. And please, let's welcome Stephen McAdams for the opening address.
Okay, thanks, Chip, for welcoming us all. I would like to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Schulich School of Music, and Kermit for their generous support of this wonderful conference, as well as the organizing committee and the International Evaluation Committee, who worked very hard to make this as high caliber as it can be. There's a rising interest in very recent times in timbre. It's a subject of scholarly study. And although its explicit or implicit use by musicians dates back at least several centuries or even millennia in cultures throughout the world, I think that recent events and the passionate discussions and sessions yesterday and the palpable reception last night, the palpable buzz at the reception last night, are clear signs that the goddess of timbre is smiling upon us with her 13 disciplinary heads and myriad ears. And she's going to be listening to our musings about timbre and say, this is a good thing. But be careful, because those 13 disciplinary heads are often arguing with each other about terminology, so I'm sure that bit of that will go on as well. This use by musicians of timbre, in stark contrast with its scholarly treatment in Western music theory, musicology, ethnomusicology, and perceptual psychology until very recently, is something that we need to deal with here. In the not too distant past, there have been some important volumes on timbre. It started with Jean-Baptiste Barrière's Le Timbre, métaphore pour la composition, Timbre, a metaphor for composition, back in 1991. And then 2 decades later, we had the Orchestral Revolution by Emily Dolan, and a recent issue on timbre in the Contemporary Music Review by Isabella van Elfren. And there's a book coming out, or it's partially coming out online already, the Oxford Handbook of Timbre, edited by Emily Dolan and Alex Redding. And of course, we heard yesterday about The Relentless Pursuit of Tone by Fink, Latour, and Wallmark, which should be out in August, I believe. And then coming in early 2019, hopefully, book Tambor, Acoustics, Perception, and Cognition, co-edited by Kai Siedenberg and Harry Saitis and myself. So today what I'd like to do, why did it go backwards? That's weird. Where's my mouse? Oh, there's the mouse. Okay, thank you. The title of this talk and even the idea for the conference grew out of a Berlin interdisciplinary workshop on timbre organized by Kai and Haris, and in particular a closing panel in which we desperately and unsuccessfully tried to converge on a definition of timbre. Long story short, chaos reigned. And at that time I said, why don't we focus on what we can do with timbre? And then we all went out for beers and forgot about it. So today I'd like to address both of these issues. This talk will voluntarily be polemical and characterizing to get the debate going and increase people's adrenaline levels. Don't take any of it personally. I'll start with what it is and show that it depends on who you are, attempt to circumscribe what it is from my psychoacoustical perspective, and conclude that there are probably interesting questions to ask, such as, what can we do with it? I will end with a brief survey of work we're doing in the Orchestration and Perception project here at McGill, and introduce you to a newly formed international partnership funded by Schulich. I'll not bother restating the useless negative definition of timbre. It's everyone's favorite dead horse to beat. Let's look instead at some positive definitions, most of which are misconceptions in my mind. One is that timbre is a sounding object, okay? This leads people to say things like the timbre of the clarinet, as if there's something about the sound that is the same for all sounds produced by a clarinet. And this relates to notions of structural invariance in ecological psychology, where the sound specifies something about the source, no matter what sound that source is actually putting out. But why do we have different names for all the registers of the clarinet? All the timbres of those sounds are not the same. So if it's a timbre, then why are there so many timbres? And what about the difference across dynamics? And does this, whatever it is that's the clarinet, generalize across the whole family of clarinets, the E flat, the B flat, the bass, and the contrabass? If that's the case also, then why is it that people don't recognize all instruments correctly at all different possible pitches that they can play? Here's some research we did recently with Grace Wang, Elitse, and Etienne Torre, where you basically have along the x-axis all the different pitches that can be played by a given instrument. We have strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion instruments were included in the study. And on the y-axis is the correct recognition rate of those instruments, identifying what the instrument was when they heard a sound played at one of these pitches. And if this notion of the timbre of the clarinet, the timbre as a sounding object, were true, all those lines should be flat. And you notice they're not flat, they're all very peaked. So we recognize some instruments well at some pitches and not so well at other pitches. So that suggests that that's not necessarily a good thing. Another notion is that timbre is a physical sound event. And this is a notion that Jim Beauchamp has been complaining about for decades, and rightly so. People say, we played a timbre to a listeners. It's a shorthand for playing a sound to people, the acoustic properties of which give rise to a specific timbre, and those properties are being varied in the experiment. But the shorthand has led to misconceptions and to all kinds of circular musings among philosophers and epistemologists of sound, and has unfortunately penetrated into the minds of musicologists, music theorists, and psychologists as well. So if timbre is a sound, then what is it that's in the mind of the listener? Another notion is that timbre is a perceptual quality derived from acoustic information in sound events. I think this gets a bit closer to home, but has its own issues, primarily of a methodological nature, limiting its generalization. First of all, it depends on the nature of sound and neural transduction. Having a sound happen, it's not recorded in the brain, presented identically. It gets transformed in many ways. Also, some researchers in this case then tend to focus primarily on the acoustic parts, and this has led to the development of audio descriptors galore in both psychoacoustics and in music information retrieval, and none of which have been, or very few have been, actually been validated in terms of their perceptual reality. So people here basically jettison the perceptual part and unfortunately focus only on these quantitative signal descriptors, which they consider to stand in for perception in a certain sense. People who are doing psychoacoustic experiments then try to find descriptors that they can correlate with various aspects of perception of timbre, and this has been more or less successful, linking acoustics to perception, which is the whole realm of psychophysics, but there's a lot of arbitrariness that abounds in choosing which descriptors to correlate with various perceptual aspects. And there's a lot of data massage that goes on and cherry picking here, trying to find the thing that actually works and ignoring all the things that don't work. Also, a lot of these experiments then use sounds that are not necessarily produced expressively, and even though you say this is the sound of a clarinet playing a C-sharp 4 at a mezzo piano, that could change depending on the intention of the person actually playing it. There's a lot of performance variables that could change that particular sound. It also ignores a lot of higher level influences of knowledge and past experience with sound sources which come to influence what it is people are actually judging about these things. Another conception is that timbre is a set of qualia that are describable with language. And this leads to such things as people feeling that true perceptual dimensions are associated uniquely with words that have specific meanings, and that semantic profiles characterize how musical sound sources are perceived. And what about the problem of polysemy in all this? So this raises the question, are there words for all the subtle things in timbre that we can hear in music? And how do we deal with the fact that some words actually can mean many different things, like bright or rich and so on? So the question here is, what are the limitations of conception that are engendered by constraining the understanding of timbre to what is verbally describable? This domain may be useful for understanding how people think about and talk about timbre, but it isn't clear how it helps define timbre per se, as it's then filtered through a very selective sieve. Another notion that has come out is the notion of timbre as some kind of emergent property from many perceptually distinguishable instruments, or what is called by Vinu Alluri polyphonic timbre. Here this would be the thing that might be distinct about the sound of a band, a composer, or a songwriter, or a genre or something like that. And I think this is an interesting notion with some powerful experimental results that we'll hear more about from Vinu. But here I question the conception of the term itself, not the relevance of the results. Is it really timbre per se in this sense? Or do we need to conceive of a new type of emergent property based on timbral relations that can be perceived in an ensemble setting or a vertical sonority, which would be akin to harmony's relation to the set of pitches that one is actually listening to at a time? So let's try to circumscribe, rather than define, a little bit things that are going on for timbre, and this is my own personal view on things. Timbre is a set of auditory attributes that both carry musical qualities and collectively contribute to sound source recognition and identification. It's not the sound source, it contributes to recognizing or identifying the sound source, which is very important. So here we have shades of Bill Gaver's distinction between musical listening, which is the quality part, and everyday listening, which is identifying sound sources out in the world. Timbral qualities can arise from events that is produced by a single acoustic or electroacoustic sound source, but also can arise from events that are produced by several perceptually fused or blended sound sources. So timbre, therefore, is a perceptual property of a specific fused auditory event that depends on the spectral temporal properties of that event, but also on knowledge that people may have about that particular sound source, if it's a recognizable one to them. Timbre, it's important to understand that timbre is not just something all by itself. And particularly in musical instruments, it co-varies with every other parameter that you might imagine. Pitch, loudness or dynamics, articulation, spatial position, the radiation pattern of the instrument, and even the room acoustics and where that particular instrument might be playing in a given room. So in this sense, we might think of timbre as kind of a constrained galaxy of things. A musical instrument can produce a constrained galaxy of timbres, and it's that whole thing and the way they all co-vary with one another that actually defines the instrument itself. And this is sort of like Greg Sandel's notion of macro timbre. Sound source recognition then depends on learning all of these covariations, okay? And we can see that there are limits to that, as I showed in that one slide with some data on it, where people have a hard time learning to recognize instruments outside of their more optimal range, the one they're used to hearing, so there's the effect of knowledge playing a role as well. However, when conducting experiments on timbre, it's important to note that judgments about timbre may implicate these other sources of information from long-term memory, experience that people have had with various things. But enough of this mania for definition. As Philippe Mannery wrote in a chapter in Jean-Baptiste's book back in 1991, one of the most striking paradoxes about timbre is that when we know less about it, it didn't pose so much of a problem. What is most important about timbre, whatever it may be, is what musicians can actually do with it. So here are some of the possibilities of the musical deployment of timbre, but certainly not all. And stay for the whole conference to get a wonderful overview from 84 different perspectives. We can create new timbral percepts in fused events, extended instrumental techniques, blended sounds from different sources, synthesized or digitally augmented instrument sounds, mixing and editing techniques in the studio, and so forth. And we can actually form different auditory streams or musical lines on the basis of timbre, where similar timbres tend to form streams and different timbres tend to get segregated into different streams. We can form different orchestral strata, where loosely grouped instruments in foreground and background layers are usually similar in timbre, but also timbral salience will help us decide which one is actually in the foreground, the one that draws our attention. And we'll come back to some of these issues related to auditory grouping in a moment. We can use timbral variation to create rhythmic patterns with timbral accents. And this is the role of timbral salience again playing a role, but also it might be that the contextual issues like which timbre is more different than the others might actually create an accent pattern. And the interaction between timbre and rhythm plays a strong role in groove in popular music and in many rhythmic textures in contemporary classical music. We can develop systems of more or less abstract relations among timbres. Can we talk about timbral contours and timbral intervals, which would allow for various kinds of patterns? Can these patterns then be perceived, memorized, and recognized under various kinds of transformations? Like we have the notion of transposition of a melody in pitch. Can we have some notion of transformation or rotation of a timbral pattern in timbre space or something like that? And we can use timbral continuity and change to create a hierarchical structure of sections in music through the degree of change. Here, the degree of change there might signal the strength of motivic, phrasal, thematic, or sectional boundaries. And we'll come back again to this last notion when we talk about auditory grouping in a moment. We can set timbre into formal counterpoint with structures based on pitch and duration, so to actually put them in conflict. And this raises John Rea's notion of musical form versus orchestration form. And here one question that arises, under what conditions does one parameter dominate or interact with the others? Under what can we do with musically to have these things play with one another and one be more dominant and the other be less dominant? We can create timbral forms that evolve over time while maintaining the coherence of a smaller or larger scale musical unit, things like timbral trajectories and timbral modulations, or even dramatic orchestral gestures. We can color and shape the emotional tone of music with timbre. This is a very important thing in many cases. You can have something that's a very deep, dark, melancholy thing you're trying to get. It's going to be hard to get it with crotales and glockenspiels, for example. And there are many other marvelous things, and the rest of you will talk about that. So after this whirlwind listing of some possibilities, many of which will be dealt with by you, let me now describe some work we've been doing here at McGill in our Orchestration and Perception project related to several possibilities that concern auditory grouping and timbre. Analyses of scores and treatises reveal that many orchestration names are related to auditory grouping principles. In terms of auditory scene analysis, auditory grouping processes organize the acoustic environment, and they determine, first of all, what sounds are grouped together into musical events in concurrent grouping. They determine whether these events are connected into musical streams or layers in sequential grouping, and they determine how listeners chunk event streams into musical units such as motifs, phrases, themes, or sections. According to Bregman's notion that perceptual qualities are computed on the results of grouping processes, what might be the perceptual qualities and corresponding orchestral effects? I'm using the term effects here as perceptual effects of orchestration. Timbre emerges from the perceptual fusion of acoustical components into a single auditory event, And it gives rise to timbre, pitch, dynamics, and spatial position, which are properties of events. And we oftentimes talk in terms of orchestration, in terms of whether things are blended or not blended, creating timbral blend or timbral heterogeneity. Timbral similarity is involved in auditory stream integration, the perceptual connection of events over time, and timbral differences provoke the segregation of events into different streams or orchestral layers. So streaming gives rise to melodies and rhythms in a stream. Melody is a property of a stream, rhythm's a property of a stream, and timbral patterns would be a property of a stream. And here we can talk about segregation or integration in terms of orchestral effects. Timbre is also involved in segmental grouping. Discontinuities can promote chunking of musical units, whereas a succession of unchanging or gradually changing blended or integrated instrumental sounds creates a sense of continuity, which would be chunked as one unit. These principles are part of our genetic heritage, and although fine-tuned by cultural exposure, they tend to operate regardless of style or type of sound source, be it acoustic or electroacoustic. So let me talk a little bit about an analysis, a taxonomy of orchestration effects based on auditory grouping that we've begun to develop here at McGill, starting primarily with Megan Goodchild and Kit Soden. Concurrent grouping has to do with what information gets fused together perceptually, and it's related to the blending of sound sources in orchestration. Blend is graded and can be more or less strong. Sequential grouping has to do with which events get connected perceptually or temporally integrated over time into auditory streams or segregated into two or more streams. Now there's a continuum between completely integrated and completely segregated, allowing for looser groupings of instruments into foreground and background layers or strata, or integration of melodic and rhythmic materials into textures of some kind. Segmental grouping involves the hierarchical chunking of events into musical units that one usually associates with motifs, cells, phrases, and the like. It organizes material into spans of time over which various parameters that are fairly similar get segmented from other adjacent time spans when significant change in the parameters occurs, creating a boundary. The more significant the change, the stronger the sense of segmentation or boundary strength. The units that are formed like this can be smaller scale, as in antiphonal contrast, timbral echoes, or chains of timbral change that create sort of bouncing materials between instruments, or they can be larger scale sections and movements. Within larger scale sections, progressive changes may occur, such as timbre melodies and gradual timbral modulations, or even large-scale units with a dramatic function may be formed as orchestral crescendos or diminuendos, walls of sound, and sudden drop-offs. I'd like to emphasize here the variable strength of all of these effects. None is all or none, and so that leaves some room for play on the part of composers. So now let's look at concurrent grouping. Perceptual fusion results in the formation of auditory events, as I said before. Event formation depends on concurrent grouping principles, such as do things start and stop at the same time? Are they in a harmonic relationship? Do they change in parallel in both amplitude and frequency, or pitch and dynamics, if you prefer? And a classic example of this is Bolero by Ravel, where he used all of these principles by stacking up instruments in a harmonic series, having them start and stop together, and play everything perfectly in parallel in pitch and dynamics. But fusion depends also on spectral relations, and this is some work that's done by Christoph Reuter and Sven-Amin Lemke. Here we can find that overlap in the frequency spectra of different constituent events can determine whether things are fusing or not. If they're very separated and very different, so if you have an English horn and 3 octaves higher, a glockenspiel playing, or a celesta, they're not going to fuse very well together. Whereas if I have a French horn and a bassoon playing together with spectra that are overlapping, you're going to get much more of this fusion. But you can also get fusion with things that are very dense spectrally, in the case of certain kinds of sound mass music and things like that, because you can't analyze all the sounds. They're all too densely packed to sort of tease it apart. Auditory attributes such as pitch and timbre, so on, are computed from event properties according to Bregman's principle. So grouping precedes the extraction of these various auditory attributes. Now, musicians use the notion of blend, which we interpret primarily as related to the degree of perceptual fusion, but it's actually a bit more complicated than that. For example, one of my students, Piero Gianferrara, found that one can experience a sense of multiplicity and blend simultaneously under certain conditions. So we need to explore that quite a bit more. However, other things are completely segregated and are not blended, and those that are strongly fused are strongly blended. Therefore, timbre, in this case, depends on the concurrent and grouping processes, so it's a way to create timbre by getting things to fuse together. Here's an example taken from Debussy's La Mer and the first movement, where we have basically the English horn and two solo celli that are playing here together. And I'm going to play some examples here that have been realized in the OrgSim system by Denis Boulian and Félix Baril. And this is a tool that I think you should explore because it has completely changed the face of what is possible in perceptual research on orchestration. So first, let's listen to just the English horn. And now with the celli. So we've actually augmented the sound of the English horn with the celli here. And to save time, I'm not going to play the full context. Move on to sequential grouping, where we have segregation or integration of streams, textual integration, and stratification. Auditory streams represent the behavior of sound sources over time. And perceptual organization can connect similar sounds into auditory streams on the basis of spectral continuity, related to pitch or timbre, loudness continuity, dynamics, and spatial continuity. Generally, normal sound sources don't tend to jump around in all of these different parameters. Successive sounds from the same source tend to be similar in timbre, and sounds with different timbres tend to come from different sources. Therefore, timbral differentiation can cause stream segregation. And we know that this can depend on the degree of difference between the timbres, and this can be related to the difference between timbres in timbre space studies and so on. Here's an example, again done with OrgSim system, from Vaughan Williams' Eighth Symphony, the second movement, where we have, basically we're going to have here two blended streams. One's a stream of two clarinets playing in octave relations, so they have that harmonic, and they're starting and stopping, and they're playing in perfect parallel, and similarly for a stream formed out of two bassoons. So the segregation between the bassoons and the clarinets playing in octave doublings here, the rhythmic differences are enhanced by timbral and registral continuity within each stream, and then the differences between the two streams. These segregation effects can be stronger or weaker depending on the timbral dissimilarities among instruments, and the compositional goal may at times be to vary this over time. Textual integration is when two or more instruments with contrasting but often interweaving rhythmic or melodic figures are playing at the same time, and they get integrated into a single textural layer. And the important thing here is that they're perceived as more than a single instrument, but less than two or more clearly segregated streams. And I'll have an example of that in a moment. Stratification or orchestral layering is when two or more layers of musical material are separated into more or less prominent strands. And notions of foreground, middle ground, and background are raised here. So the notion of some things are up front, other things are further back, and your attention is drawn to things that are in the foreground in general. At least one of these layers may often have more than one instrument playing at a time. So you can have a blended thing going on in like a foreground or a middle ground. You can have a textual integration in a middle ground, and you might have other things going on in the background. You can even have two segregated streams of instruments that are actually in the foreground. They're co-equal, but they're in up front where you can pay attention to them. Here's an example with both of these. You can see on the bottom we have the violins in the foreground indicated by the black box. Then we have this textual integration indicated by yellow, but which is in the middle ground indicated by the gray box. And finally in the background we have the horns and the harp here, although there are times where the harp seems to emerge more towards the foreground as we listen to this. So this is from Smetana di Moldau. And the textual integration here is with all those two flutes and two clarinets that are all interweaving with one another. Now let's look at segmental grouping with various kinds of contrasts. And to our knowledge, there's been no experimental work on this class of effects aside from some general timbral contrasts and sectional boundaries. Any kind of acoustic discontinuity can provoke segmentation, including timbral discontinuity. Irene Deliège has shown that changes in timbre cause segmentation or chunking of sequences, and large-scale sections of music can be formed on the basis of similarities in register, texture, and instrumentation, and then section boundaries happen when those kinds of things change. So this includes timbre. One thing I want to point out is people talk about, is it register or is it timbre? But any instrument that I know of, you change the register and you're changing the timbre, so you can't actually really separate the two. So I'd like to emphasize here the play between continuity and discontinuity and its effect on boundary strength and segmentation. The importance here is that timbre change can create boundaries, and timbral similarity causes chunking events into continuous units. So by having similar timbres over a while and then a change, you're actually creating segmentation and creating musical structure in that way. One example of contrast I'd like to look at the smaller scale are antiphonal sections, which are often composed as a call and response motif or phrase structure. And in this particular case, we find that each alternating musical chunk is scored with different contrasting instrumentation to highlight the contrast in this particular case. So orchestration enhances this structure, and one question we ask is whether there are patterns in the choice of instruments for calls and responses, or initial material and its timbrally different echo for a given composer or a given epoch. This is something that we would like to do through music analysis. Here's an example of this kind of a thing in Franck's Symphony in D minor, number 3, where we're going to have a brass choir alternating with the woodwinds and strings to set off the musical units. So one question here is, why did he pick the brass for the first one and the strings and winds for the second one and not something else? Moving on to the continuous aspect of segmental grouping. To our knowledge, again, no empirical research has addressed these issues either. Here we have, I would like to focus on these notions of continuity and particularly focus on Klangfarben melody as a technique for continuity with timbral change. Klangfarben melody is a sound color melody, which is a succession of tone colors analogous to pitches in a melody, and it serves a kind of melodic function in our particular conception of this. Now, this technique was first theorized by Schoenberg and Webern, and their notions of it were quite different. What we call Klangfarben melody is closer to Webern's notion, whereas Schoenberg's is closer to what we call timbral modulation, as one finds at the opening of Farben movement of his 5 pieces for orchestra, opus 16. Now, oftentimes in Webern's use of Klangfarben melody, temporal coherence is not always achieved because the timbral sequences sometimes have large leaps, in which case this results in segmentation and fragmentation, or what you might call Klangfarben-Zersplitterung, as was times the evident in Webern's use of this technique in some of his pieces. The abrupt timbral change can be used effectively if one seeks a kind of pointillistic rather than melodic texture, but then it's more a case of micro-segmentation. One other thing that's important here is that to get this timbre melody that actually has a melodic function, because melody is a property of a stream, you can't have too large of timbral changes because otherwise it will split up, as I said. So they have to be small enough to achieve temporal coherence here. Here's an example of a Klangfarben melody, one of my favorite, from Roger Reynolds' The Angel of Death, from the 5th theme, the 4th section. And here, basically what he's done is he's taken this timbre melody, and it starts off with one instrument joined by another instrument joined by another, all playing in unisons or octaves, so that you get this kind of slowly modulating timbre, but then moves to another set of instruments, and this slowly builds up and passes from group to instrument to group to instrument. And you can indicate by these lines here where there are certain blends that are going on inside of this thing to create new timbres and modulating timbres over the whole thing. In addition, in this piece, there's also, in this particular section, there's several kinds of sounds that are actually sort of timbral resonances of notes that are played by other instruments. So it's a kind of like a pedaling effect that's emphasizing the harmony here. First, I'd like to play a piano version so that you get a sort of unitimbre version of this, as much as a piano can be unitimbral, and then I'll play the more orchestral version. Now for orchestral gestures. Orchestral gestures result from both segmental grouping contrasts or their absence through progressive changes or continuity. The term orchestral gesture has been used informally in past scholarship, but has not been sufficiently defined. Rather than effects or techniques, Megan Goodchild has argued in her dissertation that our understanding of large-scale expressive textual shaping would benefit from being framed within the literature on musical gestures themselves. Megan proposed a typology of orchestral gestures defined by a large-scale changes in instrumentation over time based on time course, either gradual or sudden change, and direction, either additive or reductive change. Each gesture adds or removes instruments gradually or suddenly as a coordinated process over time. Due to the combination of instrumental texture, dynamics, tempo, and other dimensions, these orchestral gestures can give rise to strong emotional experiences. Orchestral gestures have a goal-directed sense of motion that plays structural and expressive role in the musical experience as carriers of emotional force. Gradual gestures are characterized by a sense of developing orchestral growth or progressive abatement, and the sudden gestures represent a rhetorical shift within the musical processes at hand. Sudden change in texture and timbre often marks a dramatic turning point. Megan developed a visualization approach to facilitate the analysis of the various musical features of the orchestral gesture, as well as the emotional response profiles. In this particular example you see here, we have time going this way, and this is a number of instruments actually playing, with the different instrument families being shown in colors. Texture is coded as the number of independent parts sounding at each beat, and the instrument family is indicated in color, as I said. The average emotional intensity ratings are shown in black for musicians and in dotted for non-musicians in this particular case. Onset density, which is measured also from the score, counts the number of onsets or attacks per beat, distinguishing between long-held notes and rapid configuration. So you can see in this particular case, there's quite a lot of onset density happening, then suddenly at the change, it's much sparser in terms of rhythmic density. The contour variable sort of tracks the ambitus, or the notated spread between the lowest and highest instrumental parts. And then we can also measure various kinds of things from an actual performance, and these are performance variables, where we have tempo, how is it actually played, what's the rate of things are going along, loudness being extracted from the recording in sones, calibrated to the level in the room, and spectral centroid indicates the center of mass of the spectrum and is associated with timbral brightness, In Uranus, the drop-off in instrumental texture is coupled with a significant decrease in loudness and tempo and onset density, and ambitus remains very wide throughout, which highlights the sparse texture after the drop-off. And we also see a gradual decline in the brightness as what happens here. The musician's ratings generally increase in intensity, through the beginning, but then they keep on going after the drop-off. Which sort of indicates that somehow there's a lingering effect of whatever the power of that, what was going on beforehand. Non-musicians tend to drop off a bit, but still remain fairly high. We've seen this oftentimes in the reductive gestures, where there's this kind of lingering emotional intensity that remains after this has happened, after the big change has happened in a certain sense. So the high emotional intensity may be linked to both the combination of the surprising textural change followed by the tense atmosphere created by the heart melody and dissonant sustained chords and strings. So, to conclude, timbre through orchestration has many musical functions. It can arise from perceptual fusion, which are emergent perceptual properties. It can distinguish voices in polyphonic textures. It can contribute to the formation of orchestral layers. It can be used to underscore various kinds of contrastive structures at smaller and larger scales. And it can provide sectional structure. And it can contribute to the building of timbral trajectories and modulations and much larger scale orchestral gestures. I'm perfectly aware that I haven't addressed several important aspects of orchestration, such as why certain instruments are chosen for the character of a given passage, or how they underscore the formal processes of the music, or even why certain combinations of timbres are used to evoke a desired emotional tone. Here one thinks of the solo English horn melody in the third act of Tristan and Isolde, or the nationalistic majesty of the brass in the opening of Finlandia. But one thing I hope to have communicated is that music analysis cannot be confined to pitch and duration, just as discussions of painting cannot limit themselves to forms and brightness. Timbre is not simply cosmetic, musical lip gloss and eyeshadow, or as the otherwise brilliant music theorist Leonard Meyer called it, a secondary musical parameter. Timbre is a powerful structuring force and a vehicle for musical expression and emotion that is realized through orchestration and depends on all the perceptual processes that give rise to sonic richness. Let me tell you now very briefly, before my time's up, about the ACTOR project. The ACTOR project is a large-scale networking project, a partnership grant funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which will have a website at this point, actorproject.org, organized into three major axes, one focusing on analyses of all possible kinds, development of various kinds of tools for creation and exploration, research exploration, and then innovating in areas of pedagogy, musical study, and composition. Then one of the main aim here is to try to get together music analysis, text analysis of treatises and interviews, perceptual analysis, analysis of actual performances, and a performance analysis itself with our various kinds of tools, and then feed all of that, confront all those different approaches together to try to understand what is going on in orchestration, and feed that into our orchestration analysis and research database, which we fondly call Orchard. And then that will allow us for possibilities of data mining across all these different modalities of information that are being brought together. We're going to also be developing generative tools like the OrgSim orchestration rendering system, and then various kinds of computer-aided orchestration environments, such as Orchid's, I guess it's called Orchidea now, at IRCAM. It keeps moving and changing, which is a good thing. And then all of these different kinds of results and the tools developed to explore the results and to generate new kinds of things are going to be applied to pedagogical innovation. How do you teach orchestration and make it more effective? Because at this point, orchestration studies are oftentimes very much based on learning hundreds and thousands of examples and then drawing your own conclusions about it with not a whole lot of basic principles behind those things. So we're working very hard to come up with principles and using the various kinds of tools available here that allow that kind of thing to go on as well. And this is already taking place here at McGill in some of the orchestration classes, and notably with Denis Boulian. We also want to see innovation in bringing people to understand that timbre is a very important thing to understand in musicology, in music theory, and in ethnomusicology. So all brand of music studies need to be taken into account here. And then, of course, we want this to turn into creation as well. So we want some of these tools and notions to be applicable in terms of creating compositional innovation. And all this stuff will eventually go on to our online orchestration resource, which will be kind of like an online orchestration treatise, if you will. And I want to thank many people, notably Orc-Play Music Library, who have been a very great source for us, and also the Music Perception and Cognition Lab. This is actually a picture from 2 years ago when we were all wearing our Timbre Geek t-shirts, and notably because Megan is there as well, and I wanted her to be on the picture. And then, of course, all our funding sources. Thank you.